The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Good morning and welcome to this edition of Insights. I'm Aaron Parsegian. I'm joined this morning by ACC Professor of Political Science Tim Kuhnlein. Tim, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
So let's talk a little bit about the federal budget, and there were some recent announcements going along with that.
Yes, well, I think we're finally getting to the place in the transition where the White House is presenting its version of preferences for the budget. As we get into March and certainly into April, we're running up against deadlines, and of course Congress has to formally approve budgets. They have the power to authorize expenditures and so forth, but the President and the White House present their preferences, and then we reconcile many of these suggestions between the White House and Congress. So what we're seeing is the White House, now that the Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney has been established, we're starting to see memos circulating about potential budgets and particularly cuts to reconcile books.
And so let's talk a little bit specifically what these cuts would be.
Well, we're getting a short list of some areas that have been long on the chopping block, particularly for Republicans. They tend to do with smaller programs. They tend to be pet peeve projects for certain groups. And so, for example, there are roughly 9 that are being bandied about right now, and I'll just read these off. Legal Services Corporation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, AmeriCorps, the Appalachian Regional Commission, Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Export-Import Bank, which has been a particular issue for the Koch brothers, and the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. These are just some examples. Clearly there will be more extensive cuts to drive the agenda that Trump put forth in the campaign, and certainly Republicans have been chomping at the bit for some time. But this is kind of an indication of where we're probably going to go.
And a lot of these have local implications too, because you mentioned the cutting of public television, public radio, AmeriCorps, which is there's even a local base right here at the National Marine Sanctuary where a lot of the AmeriCorps members work.
That's right. I mean, these are issues that are chump change. I mean, combined, all of those programs I just listed are about $500 million, so $500 million. The smaller programs that are being proposed are about $2.5 billion in total cuts. And this really is not really the core, it's not going to solve the problem of the national deficits. I think the real question is, we all understand we've got to reconcile our books. This has been a long-standing problem. I in particular think this is one of our greatest national security threats. But the sad part about this is that you can see how so many of these programs will trickle down to us locally, particularly in the arts. I can see it from my own experiences. And I know that we need to, at some point, reconcile that something's got to be done. But I think the real issue here is what will be done, and is it the best course of action? Because it's pretty clear that the attempt here is to shift money from some programs to make that money available for other programs, and it really begs the question, is the problem, which is the deficits and the national debt, really going to be impacted by any of this? Or are we sacrificing some pretty important things, especially for small rural communities like ours that are beneficiaries of this, that are being sacrificed for a larger cause that isn't really going to prove itself out.
So when we talk about the federal deficit, it's obviously a huge amount of money. And when you talk about these programs that are cutting, they only make up a minuscule amount. You said only $500 million of the entire thing. So what do you think the significance of these even being cut is?
Right. So for example, for the National Endowment for the Arts, it's a total budget of $146 million a year. And that's like 1/100th of 1% of the total discretionary budget. So when we're looking at a $2 trillion discretionary budget for federal operations in totality, and then another $2 trillion, if you lose sight of these numbers, $2 trillion for the mandatory programs like Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare and Social Security, as well as Medicaid, which is financed out of the withholding tax. We're looking at a total $4 trillion national budget. And so, you know, these smaller programs are obviously pennies. Every penny counts. But we're certainly not going to reconcile the national deficit or the national debt by just simply cutting these programs.
And so when you say a $4 trillion budget, what exactly has to be done, really the scope of this deficit issue?
Well, you know, we are running about $500 billion annual deficits. And we have a total of accrued debt of about 19 trillion, and counting, it's going over 19 trillion clearly. And so with each successive year of deficit, we add to that amount. And so the real problem here is the gap between what we're bringing in revenue and what we're budgeting to spend and what we're actually spending beyond budget, because of course we're never falling within those parameters. We've actually managed to pull things back into order. We were having $500 billion deficits under the Bush administration, George W., since 9/11. And then when the financial collapse occurred in 2008-9, we went into trillion-dollar deficits, and we've managed to get those under control. Of course, all of this is happening as we engage in the war on terror, which is extremely expensive, and this is following up from the Cold War, which was extremely expensive, and none of this have we paid for. It's all on credit, and we've reached our credit limits. So these deadlines coming up in April, for example, funding for the current fiscal year ends in April 28th. We're probably going to see some major budget battles like we've seen in the recent history.
In recent history, they've had government shutdowns when something like this occurs as well.
Yeah, I doubt that's going to be the case here because we have the same party in charge of both branches of government. But the real question here is the debt ceiling and whether this Congress, a Republican Congress and a president will authorize the expansion of this opportunity to go further and further into debt. If they want to reconcile the books, which there's a lot of indication they will, how deep will these cuts have to be, and is it reasonable? So then we have to look at the tax side of the equation.
And just very quickly, talking about the difference between a discretionary part of the budget and the other part of the budget, what is the difference in that?
Well, the discretionary side is basic operations of the federal government. So the largest portion of the discretionary budget is for national defense. Our Defense Department is just around $600 billion. So it's almost half of, well, a quarter of the discretionary budget of $2 trillion. But when you add up Department of Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs and state, all of which are foreign related, you're clearly at $1 trillion or more, which leaves the remainder of that $2 trillion on the discretionary side for domestic programs, including infrastructure programs that Trump has, and Democrats for some time have advocated. Obviously, there's a necessity. The other side of the equation then is the so-called entitlement programs, but they're financed through withholding taxes, and it's basically, they're supposed to be self-financing Medicare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We pay into those with withholding tax, a separate tax from our income tax, and well, there are some challenges there. So that makes up the other $2 trillion for a roughly $4 trillion annual federal budget.
All right, well, we're going to continue this conversation after the break, so stay tuned because there's more insights coming up. Welcome back to Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, we were just talking about the federal budget, and we're talking about some of our 9 programs that we're likely going to get cut under the new Congress. So let's talk about when you cut these programs, where's that money actually going to go, do you think?
Well, you would think that the money would be saved and work towards the larger problem of the deficits and the national debt. But again, when the interest on our national debt is $300 billion or more a year, you know, the $500 million that they'd be saving from this is just a drop in the bucket. But nonetheless, it's a start, one could argue, with implications. I think what we're seeing, however, is an attempt to curtail spending in some areas so that spending in other areas can be increased. And clearly, the military is one of those areas. I don't know exactly the statistics, but I've heard figures of around somewhere around a 20% increase in the federal defense budget. But we know that Trump has, and many would jump on board, including Democrats, of infrastructure improvements in the amount of $1 trillion. Well, here we go. Are we cutting sufficiently in some areas to justify an increase of $1 trillion in infrastructure development, which is sorely needed? But can we do this simply through cuts, or will it require increased taxes? And then, you know, the wall alone, in terms of infrastructure, they're saying is going to be, low estimates are $10 to $15 billion, up to $30 to $40 billion. So you compare that to the $2.5 billion of total cuts in this first memo on where we might be going. You can see how this just doesn't add up in terms of the larger equation of balanced books.
And yeah, so when you cut something so small, it's only going to be just a chip away at what we actually need to take care of.
Yeah, if we cut, but then we spend that money in other areas and we continue to do it on deficit spending, you know, I think most of us can realize that deficit spending can be useful, but if we're never reconciling the books, particularly during our heydays, it's obviously caught up with us. You know, our country's only been out of debt basically 1 year. I think it was 1836. So debt itself is not the problem. It's the proportionality of the debt to the GDP and to the total wealth of the nation, which are kind of two separate issues, and your ability to tap into that wealth and that gross domestic product in order to maintain a proportional debt ratio to the total economy.
And moving forward to April, that's when Congress, you know, gets together and decides the budget and proposes their budget.
Yeah, we'll go through all the budget reconciliations, and we obviously have to deal with the debt ceiling issue as well. We've already been downgraded in terms of our credit rating as a result of everything that happened in 2008 and 2009. You know, is this a crisis situation? Probably not, but obviously we've got to start seriously figuring out where we find money to continue to grow and develop. And I guess the real question is, are we going to achieve anything by nipping away at the heels of some of these programs that have beneficial outcome for small communities like ours, particularly relatively speaking, more impoverished communities, rural communities throughout our country that benefit from those federal monies, helping leverage local money to make the quality of life much greater.
And so one would think they would have to raise taxes to really raise money to pay off these debts, but kind of a conservative idea would be to cut taxes for most of the people. So how would that end up working?
Well, and that is what's being suggested, right? Or tax restructuring that, from all apparent purposes, looks like it's going to translate into lower taxes. I mean, as it is, you know, Mitt Romney was right. About half of Americans don't pay taxes already. And the reason they don't pay taxes is that most of them are at wage levels that if you took the taxes out, they'd end up on government dole. We also know that there are about 4,000 millionaires and billionaires that don't pay taxes because they have legal recourse to avoid it, and they choose to do that. And so it leaves us in a bit of a conundrum. You know, I do this exercise with my students every semester. We walk through the federal budget, and we look seriously at what could be cut, and we make some major cuts. But even if you dig deeply into the Defense Department, which is a quarter of the total budget, if not half, depending on how you look at it, you don't even begin to eke into or inch into the interest on the national debt, let alone the deficits, and we're not even talking about the debt itself.
I think it's pretty fascinating. So you're doing this exercise with your students in class. What kind of things were being cut out?
First of all, we have to develop an understanding of what's what. I mean, you have students asking, what is the Department of Interior? Well, that's our national parks. And they back away. Oh, we don't want to cut that. Then they start thinking about this program or that program, and of course, many of them are related to their job prospects and their industries of choice. And you start to realize that there are a lot of areas that could be cut. We might consider them fat or fluff or unnecessary, but in many respects, they're the impetus for a lot of our economic growth in a highly sophisticated economy. Do they put us in positions of dependency on government? I think that's debatable. I mean, the history of our country has been one of our government injecting money to foster, to facilitate private economic development. And we're having an interesting debate about regulations and how they can become overly stifling. But the reality is, many of these programs, NASA is one that they often pick. Well, NASA's already been cut to death, and it's being privatized in many respects. You know, it does beg the question, what can we afford to? And when the majority of the money is in one area, and we can't touch that for understandable reasons, the repercussions are that you cannot cut your way out of this problem.
And so, talking a little bit about the defense budget, once again, a lot of the talk has been when it moves to Congress and they kind of discuss what's going on, they're going to add more money to the defense budget while cutting out some of the other things.
Right, so it's a wash, right? Unless we do something on the revenue side of the equation, which is kind of a separate but certainly related subject. I think for me, the real concern is, as we peck away at this and as money is transferred, refocused, reprioritized, it's one thing, but I think we all need to be conscious of the fact, like with my students, the real implications, not that we shouldn't move, but the real implications. If we cut, for example, the arts, it is going to have impact on our local community. You know, just some basic statistics. The funding for the arts creates 4 million jobs, $87 billion of income for people who work in the arts industry. And that creates $22 billion of tax revenue for the federal government. And every dollar that comes from the federal grants translates into $9 of leveraged money at the local source, the state and local level. And so when the National Endowment for the Arts is not able to fund this Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs, and Alpena and Northeast Michigan can't get access to those grants, we're out all those monies. That puts the burden on us to find those monies locally in an already, one might argue, relatively impoverished area for these types of things. That type of trickle effect has a major impact on little rural communities like ours. And I'm just using arts as an example. You could pick any sector of the economy and see the same ramifications.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about local impacts of budget cuts when we return. So stay tuned because there's more insights coming up. Welcome back to Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, we've been talking about the budget a lot recently. And let's talk about how the government makes money back. So how do they get revenue?
Well, through taxation, of course, and there are various forms of taxation, but the majority of the federal government's revenue comes from taxes on our income. And about 10%, 9%, something like that, comes from taxes on corporations and their profits. And then there are smaller amounts that come from, you know, import taxes and things like that. So the overwhelming majority of revenue to operate the federal government comes from taxes on income. And
so,
again, only half of us are actually participating in that. There's this impression that it's, you know, the sloughs of society that aren't paying, but they are certainly part of the equation, but they're not the critical mass. It's the modest incomes that are at thresholds that basically, if we tax them to any great extent, they would essentially be in poverty and therefore subject to a whole series of Social Security, social welfare benefits.
And so what do you think is going to happen with taxes with the new Congress and President Trump?
Well, there's clearly momentum for tax reform, and perhaps long overdue, particularly when we look at the loopholes and things that are distorting any reasonable attempt to ascertain how much revenue we can actually expect. You know, we have the official rates, the marginal rates. No one pays those marginal rates. And those marginal rates appear to be very high. I think the highest bracket is 39.6%, and that was just recently as we got taxes back up to where they were before the Bush cuts. But no one pays those rates, right? We all have the standard deductions and whatnot. And so we talk about the effective rate. That's the real rate. You know, when Mitt Romney made $20 million the year he was running for president and said he paid 14%, you know, people were aghast, but that was all legal. And he should be in the upper brackets, right? $20 million a year. But he's taking advantage of legitimate loopholes that afford these provisions and then impact the equation in terms of the real revenue we're bringing in. And obviously it's not enough, right? We're falling short $500 billion to $500 billion on average now per year shortage.
So you expect some sort of tax reform, whether that it's likely going to be a cut in taxes?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the personal income tax. I mean, those details haven't been really emphasized as much as the corporate tax, taking our corporate tax from 35 down to 20 or even 15%. And how that translates. Now, keep in mind that federal revenues are accounted for by only about, like I said, 9 to 10% of corporate tax revenue. So, you know, how will this translate into actual revenue for the federal government? Well, it's obviously a reduction in revenues collected. The belief is that this will bring back some of the offshore resources that companies and individuals have been keeping out of the tax framework here. So that could bring in some revenue that's not been included in the equation, but it might also generate new economic activity that will then expand the tax base. You know, we've heard this for a very long time, and for one reason or another, we tend to keep going either deeper and deeper into the hole or remaining static. So I'm not holding my breath, but one thing I know is that you cannot solve this national deficit issue, and certainly our national debt, by simply cutting. It will require increases in taxes, and not so much the marginal rates, but correcting the effective rates so that people are paying closer to the marginal rates, so we generate enough revenue to pay these bills.
And there's a lot of talk about, you know, capital gains tax or things these, you know, ultra billionaires and companies use so they don't have to pay an effective rate of 39% or whatever the highest.
Or 35% in terms of corporate. Yeah, so we've got to quit playing the shell game. And of course, we use taxes to create incentives, right, for various things, social behavior as well as economic activity. And we've probably reached a point where we're not going to be able to play that game. What we need is a cleaner, standardized process that is fair, that generates the revenue from where the resources are, and it's quite frankly not in the hands of most Americans. It's concentrated. And but this is going to be a tough fight, because every point in history when societies have been faced with these types of conundrums, you know, this is really the foundation of the American Revolution. It was about taxes, people who didn't want to pay taxes, people who were forced to pay the taxes, and the reaction was the same situation in the French Revolution. And you know, we have other minor examples of this, but how we manage this discussion is going to be critical, and getting the formula right is becoming increasingly ever more urgent.
Well, it's definitely an interesting topic. I want to thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Well, that will do it for this edition of Insights. Be sure to join us at the same time, same place next week for even more.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.